Hello everyone, Colin Canet here for Woodworkweb. Today we're doing our second installment on videos for newcomers to woodworking, and today we're going to talk about blades for table saws. I often see new woodworkers getting very confused with what blades they should be using in their table saw, and the first thing I can tell you is always buy an excellent quality blade. It doesn't matter what your saw is like. What counts is the quality of your blade, and we'll put a link to how to select quality blades at the end of this. Today we're only going to talk about 4 types of blades. We're going to make it very simple and very easy for you. The first blade I want to talk about is the ripping blade, and a ripping blade is used for natural woods, for ripping, for cutting with the grain. And a ripping blade typically has 24 to maybe 30 teeth, and you can see how big the teeth are, and there's big gaps between them, and there needs to be, because as the blade is spinning, it needs to move fiber out of the board. So that's why you look for a ripping blade with only 24 teeth. The next blade we want to talk about is a cross-cut blade, and you can see this one has 90 teeth, lots of teeth on a cross-cut blade compared to, say, a ripping blade. And the reason that you have all of these small teeth, because now you're cutting across the grain. You're not ripping fibers out, you're cutting across, so you're really just making sawdust, but you want to make a really nice clean cut, so you need lots of teeth to do that, and that's how you identify a ripping blade. Ripping blades often have 60 to 90 teeth. The next blade I want to talk about is something called a combination. Some people call it a general purpose blade. And these blades are good for ripping, and they're good for cross-cutting. They're not as good as a cross-cut, and they're not as good as a ripping blade, but for people who don't want to change blades, or maybe they can only afford one good quality blade, this might be something that you want to look at. This particular one has 50 teeth, which would be unusual for a ripping blade, but it actually does a pretty good job of ripping, and it does a very good job of cross-cutting. The advantage with a blade like this is you can put it in your table saw, and you don't have to change from a ripping to a combination blade. It does everything. It doesn't do quite as good as a dedicated blade, but it still does an adequate job. The last blade that I want to talk about today is called a composite or multi-purpose blade. This particular one is 60 teeth, and this blade is for cutting MDF materials. This is for all of your man-made materials, plywoods, MDF materials. And the reason that we select a blade like this is because with things like plywood, for example, on your top layer you've got wood running this way. Your second layer, it's going across, it's going back and forth. So with a blade like this, it actually is doing a combination of cross-cutting and ripping. This blade, your combination blade, would also do an adequate job on plywoods and MDFs. But if you're doing a lot of MDF material or a lot of plywood, this might be a blade that you want to look at. The last thing I want to talk about today is how wide blades are, and they refer to this as kerf. And this blade here, this is what we call a full kerf blade, and they're typically, for our metric friends, that's a little over 3 millimeters. In imperial, that's about a full 1/8 of an inch. Now the blade next to it, this is what they call a thin kerf, and they're typically 3/32 or about 2.5 millimeters. And the difference between these blades, as you can see, there's a lot more carbide on a full kerf blade than there is on a thin kerf blade. And what that means is this will stay sharper longer, but it's also harder on the saw, harder on the motor, harder on the woodworker, because it's taking off a lot more material. This one here, that little bit of thinner blade, it's easier on the motor, a little easier to be pushing wood through the saw, but the blades don't stay sharp as long. So that's the difference between thin kerf and full kerf. So that concludes our video on table saw blades. So now, when you go to the hardware store, you're going to have a much clearer idea how to select the kind of blades that you want. In our next video, we're going to be looking at the jointer and how to properly use the jointer to get the best results. 5 minutes will make you an expert on the jointer. I'm Colin Canet for Woodworkweb. Don't forget to subscribe, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook,